On a crisp autumn afternoon in 1977, 7 young men stood proudly for a photograph while completely engulfed in towering theatrical flames. It appeared to be a brilliant piece of artistic rebellion, a defiant visual statement perfectly crafted for a groundbreaking rock album cover. But this blazing aesthetic was not a mere stylistic prop. It was a literal death sentence unintentionally captured on camera, a chilling premonition frozen in time just days before the fire became agonizingly real. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. In the sweltering heat of August 1977, the sprawling asphalt lots of Universal Studios in Los Angeles shimmered under a heavy afternoon sun. Far removed from the gritty swamps of the Deep South, this meticulously controlled Hollywood environment was about to host absolute rock and roll royalty. David was a 30-year-old commercial photographer who possessed an undeniable talent for capturing the raw essence of musical rebellion through his camera lens. Standing amidst the fake facades of the movie sets, he carefully surveyed the area while waiting for the arrival of the legendary musicians. He knew that framing these wild southern boys against a generic studio backdrop simply would not capture the dangerous spirit of their music. The humid California breeze carried the scent of hot tar and impending creative brilliance as David finally visualized the perfect thematic concept. These were rough and tumble guys who practically sweated whiskey and breathed defiance, so they needed an aesthetic that screamed pure chaotic energy. David understood that a traditional polished glamorous portrait would instantly destroy the authentic working-class credibility that the band had spent years building. He looked around the industrial studio storage space and immediately ordered his production assistants to roll out several large metal trash barrels. The brilliant idea was to ignite a controlled inferno right behind the musicians, symbolizing their unstoppable momentum and their blazing trail of success. Could anyone have possibly predicted that this simple visual metaphor for musical triumph would eventually transform into a literal image of unspeakable horror? At that exact joyful moment, the blazing concept felt incredibly clever and perfectly aligned with the unapologetic swagger of the famous rock group. When the band finally swaggered onto the concrete lot, they brought an infectious wave of rowdy laughter and genuine southern charm with them. David enthusiastically explained the visual direction, pointing toward the heavily doused barrels that were suddenly ignited into a roaring wall of bright orange flames. The musicians genuinely loved the dangerous look of the setup, casually joking with each other while adjusting their leather jackets and denim vests. They confidently stepped directly in front of the raging fire, their faces reflecting the intense golden glow of the soaring artificial movie inferno. The intense heat radiating against their backs was completely real, but the atmosphere on set remained incredibly light-hearted and filled with joyful anticipation. This was supposed to be nothing more than a visually striking album cover, celebrating their absolute dominance over the competitive American music industry. Thick plumes of dark smoke drifted lazily upward into the clear blue California sky, creating a spectacular gritty contrast against the polished surroundings. The professional lighting crew quickly adjusted their massive silver reflectors, perfectly bouncing the harsh afternoon sunlight directly onto the faces of the band. Everyone on the busy production crew was completely mesmerized by the effortless magnetic charisma that these rough southern boys naturally exuded on camera. David continuously moved around the concrete space, capturing various dynamic angles while enthusiastically encouraging them to maintain their fierce and uncompromising rock expressions. The loud crackling noise of the blazing theatrical fire provided a beautifully chaotic soundtrack to what was otherwise a perfectly organized commercial photoshoot. Looking through the viewfinder of his heavy camera, David realized the composition needed just a little more physical tension to look truly spectacular. He loudly shouted over the crackling flames, directing the fearless musicians to step even closer to the intense heat of the burning barrels. The lead singer flashed a charismatic, rebellious grin and boldly stepped backward into the smoke, completely unbothered by the dangerously close roaring fire. They were young, wildly successful, and entirely invincible, treating the fiery photoshoot like just another wildly entertaining stop on their monumental rock journey. Here is where it gets interesting, as the very pragmatism of a commercial photographer unknowingly began to construct a devastating visual time bomb. David rapidly pressed the shutter button, freezing their triumphant smiles and their relaxed postures against a terrifying backdrop of violent, consuming orange flames. Every single frame captured during that boisterous California afternoon radiated an overwhelming sense of youthful invincibility and completely pure, unadulterated musical triumph. The band members eventually walked away from the fading fire, enthusiastically patting each other on the back and laughing about the sweltering heat. David began meticulously packing away his expensive lenses, feeling incredibly satisfied with the rebellious, high-energy portraits he had successfully captured on his film. There was absolutely no dark premonition hanging in the air. Nor was there any lingering sense of dread walking off that sunny lot. Was it simply a cruel twist of destiny that led them to choose the most destructive element on Earth to represent their peak? That wonderfully innocent afternoon in Hollywood effectively sealed their visual legacy, accidentally cementing a haunting prophecy that nobody could have ever possibly imagined. When the record executives first reviewed the conceptual framework for the Street Survivors album, they certainly did not see a horrifying tragedy waiting to unfold. They saw the ultimate, triumphant declaration of endurance from a band that had fought tooth and nail to conquer the unforgiving American music industry. The title itself was a hard-earned badge of honor forged in the gritty reality of endless cross-country touring and relentless ambition. These were resilient boys from the Deep South who had stubbornly clawed their way out of dusty, sweat-soaked barrooms to dominate colossal stadium stages from coast to coast. They were street survivors in the most authentic sense, successfully navigating the brutal, soul-crushing machinery of the commercial rock and roll business without ever sacrificing their raw and unapologetic edge. The striking visual metaphor of the towering flames was deliberately chosen to amplify that exact narrative of unstoppable, overwhelming momentum. In the sprawling lexicon of 1970s rock and roll, being surrounded by a roaring fire was never interpreted as a grim symbol of impending doom or inescapable destruction. Instead, it was the visceral, visual equivalent of being absolutely untouchable and radiating an infectious, dangerous energy on stage. The band was quite literally on fire during this specific historical era, experiencing a profound creative and commercial peak that felt entirely invincible to everyone involved. That blazing inferno raging directly behind them was supposed to represent their burning passion, their explosive musical energy, and their fierce, undeniable dominance over the mainstream radio airwaves. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting. The intense, sweltering heat captured in that now legendary photograph was originally orchestrated to be a massive, defiant celebration of life and ultimate victory. The profound situational twist of this iconic cover is that every single vibrant flame was meticulously designed to project an unshakable aura of immortality. They were deliberately standing tall and unbothered amidst the blaze, to visually prove that absolutely nothing in this world could ever burn them down. It was a brilliant projection of defiant Southern pride that resonated deeply with a fierce fan base who saw them as working-class heroes. The raging fire was simply a theatrical amplifier for their swagger, a deliberate artistic choice demonstrating that they were a pure force of nature capable of mastering any dangerous element. At that precise moment in American cultural history, they were far more than just another successful rock band trying to move vinyl units. They were the undisputed heavyweight champions of Southern rock, proudly carrying the weight and the wild, untamed spirit of an entire musical movement on their leather-clad shoulders. The album artwork desperately needed to be loud, brash, and unapologetically bold to perfectly match the heavy, swampy sonic weight of the tracks pressed into the record. It functioned as a vivid visual manifesto declaring that their unique brand of music was a blazing wildfire rapidly sweeping across the entire nation. Every single smouldering ember captured in that frame stood as a powerful testament to their rugged authenticity and their stubborn refusal to be tamed. When the final glossy proofs were enthusiastically approved and swiftly sent off to the massive printing presses, the prevailing mood was nothing short of euphoric. Nobody looking at those vibrant, fiery test prints saw a grim premonition or a haunting, inescapable omen of terrible things to come. The seasoned art directors, the calculating managers, and the visionary musicians themselves looked into those roaring flames and saw only a spectacular golden future stretching out endlessly before them. They believed they had successfully immortalized their absolute peak in a single wildly powerful photographic image. The picture was meant to be the definitive visual anthem of their triumphant, glorious survival, completely devoid of any dark shadows, hidden curses, or whispering ghosts. By the crisp arrival of October 1977, the highly anticipated album finally hit the shelves of local record stores across the country. Down in the sweltering humidity of Jacksonville, Florida, a 19-year-old steelworker named Tommy finished another grueling shift. Wiping the industrial grime from his exhausted face, he immediately drove his beat-up Chevy truck toward the nearest music shop. The heavy steel mills had drained his energy completely, but today was the day he would finally claim his hard-earned prize. He clutched his freshly cashed paycheck tightly, ready to trade a portion of his meager wages for a piece of pure salvation. Tommy was the living embodiment of working-class America, a young man who found his only escape within the grooves of vinyl. For thousands of blue-collar laborers just like him, this band provided a vital soundtrack to their loud and uncompromising lives. Walking into the brightly lit store, his calloused hands quickly found the brand new record sitting prominently on the front display rack. The heavy cardboard sleeve felt incredibly substantial in his grip, carrying the weight of a monumental release they had all patiently awaited. He paid the cashier with slightly trembling fingers, feeling a profound sense of ownership over this rebellious anthem of Southern pride. Stepping back out into the fading afternoon sunlight, he leaned against the rusted hood of his truck and carefully studied the cover. The striking image of the band members standing casually amidst roaring flames immediately captured his wild and restless teenage imagination. To a factory worker trapped in a monotonous routine, those fierce flames beautifully symbolized ultimate freedom and unapologetic defiance against the system. He traced the fiery edges of the photograph, completely mesmerized by the confident swagger radiating from his beloved musical heroes. Was this not the exact kind of untamed rebellion every young man secretly wished he could unleash upon the cruel modern world? But here is where it gets interesting, because the music inside was about to ignite a fire much larger than the cover. Tommy gently slid the gleaming black vinyl out of its protective paper sleeve and carefully positioned it onto his portable truck turntable. The satisfying crackle of the needle dropping perfectly onto the outer groove sent an immediate shiver down his exhausted and weary spine. As the explosive opening guitar riff flooded the cramped cabin of the Chevy, the oppressive exhaustion of the steel mill instantly vanished. He cranked the volume dial as high as it would go, letting the thunderous southern rock wash over his sweating, tired body. The raw energy pouring through those cheap dashboard speakers felt like a religious awakening for the exhausted youth of the American South. Every single note seemed to scream with the triumphant declaration of a band operating at the absolute peak of their creative powers. Tommy pounded his heavy work boots against the rusted floorboards, singing along to lyrics that perfectly understood his daily struggles and frustrations. The flames on the album cover resting in the passenger seat seemed to dance in rhythm with the chaotic and roaring guitars. It was a glorious moment of pure transcendence, where nothing else mattered, except the deafening roar of the heavy, intoxicating music. This record was never just a collection of songs for the working-class kids who spent their weekends drinking cheap domestic beer. It served as an absolute declaration of independence, a sacred text written specifically for the forgotten outcasts of the sprawling industrial landscapes. The band had brilliantly managed to capture the raging spirit of the southern streets and press it directly into mass-produced plastic. Staring at the burning musicians on the cardboard sleeve, Tommy genuinely believed these men were completely invincible gods of rock and roll. They were standing fearlessly inside an inferno, completely untouched by the destructive heat, casually smiling at the massive chaos surrounding them entirely. Driving down the dusty highway, with the windows rolled completely down, the warm evening breeze carried the aggressive melodies out into the void. Other drivers on the desolate road could hear the thunderous bass echoing for miles, a sonic signature of a brilliant cultural revolution. That beautiful October evening felt entirely infinite, a perfectly suspended moment where the golden era of southern rock reached its absolute zenith. Tommy had absolutely no idea that he was actively participating in the very last moments of this glorious and unblemished musical chapter. The brilliant Florida sunset mirrored the blazing colors painted across the iconic square album cover, resting safely right beside him. He simply let the loud music carry him away, entirely convinced that this magnificent fire would continue to burn brightly and forever. The euphoria of that monumental release week lasted exactly 3 days before the universe intervened. It was a mundane Thursday evening in October when the invincible illusion of southern rock shattered into a million jagged pieces. Tommy was cruising down a dimly lit Jacksonville highway in his beaten-up Chevy truck. The cool autumn wind was whipping through his rolled-down windows, while the heavy, defiant chords of the new record blasted from his dashboard speakers. He was 19 years old and felt entirely untouchable in that fleeting moment of American youth. The steel mill shift was over, and the weekend was stretching out before him like an open road. The flames on the album cover sitting next to him represented nothing but pure, unadulterated triumph. Then the local rock station broadcast abruptly snapped in the middle of a soaring and energetic guitar solo. It was definitely not a planned commercial break or a smooth studio transition into another popular track. The loud music was simply severed by a thick and suffocating wall of harsh, dead static. Tommy smacked the dashboard instinctively, assuming the old and dusty radio had finally given out after years of constant abuse. But the heavy static slowly gave way to a shaky, breathless voice that sounded absolutely nothing like the confident disc jockey he listened to every single night. The rhythmic hum of the highway suddenly felt incredibly isolating, as the panicked DJ struggled to form coherent words over the broken airwaves. The agonizing silence lingering between the announcer's heavy breaths was thicker and heavier than the sweltering Florida humidity. Now listen carefully, because this is where the triumphant anthem turned into a haunting dirge. The trembling voice on the radio broke the devastating news that a chartered Convair CV-240 passenger aircraft had completely vanished from the local radar screens. It had violently plunged into a dense, unforgiving swamp deeply hidden within the dark and treacherous woods of Mississippi. The doomed aircraft was carrying the very musicians Tommy was just idolizing through his roaring speakers moments prior. The soaring kings of working-class anthems had been brutally pulled from the sky by sputtering engines, failing mechanics, and empty fuel tanks. There was no glorious rock and roll rebellion in this specific terrifying moment, only the brutal reality of tearing metal and splintering pine trees in the dead of the southern night. Tommy instinctively slammed his foot down on the brake pedal and wrestled the heavy truck onto the gravel shoulder of the empty highway. The glowing yellow headlights pierced the darkness ahead, while the engine idled with a low and nervous rumble. He stared blankly out through the cracked windshield as a cold wave of profound dread washed over his exhausted body. The radio broadcast dissolved into chaotic white noise as reporters frantically scrambled to confirm the grim details of the wreckage. Tommy slowly turned his head to look at the passenger seat where the brand new record was resting in the dim amber glow of a nearby street lamp. The image of those 7 men standing confidently inside a blazing inferno was no longer a symbol of their unstoppable momentum. The triumphant heat of the street survivors had instantly turned into a chilling visual prophecy resting right there in his trembling hands. The incredibly vibrant colors of the printed cardboard sleeve seemed to cruelly mock the horrific reality unfolding hundreds of miles away in a dark and muddy swamp. He reached out with a heavy hand and twisted the volume knob until the radio clicked completely off, leaving him entirely alone with his racing thoughts. The loud and rebellious soundtrack of an entire blue-collar generation had been permanently silenced in the blink of a terrified eye. There was absolutely no more music left to play that night, only the suffocating and deafening silence of an unimaginable American tragedy. In the devastating aftermath of the tragic Mississippi plane crash, a profound silence violently suffocated the entire American music landscape. Millions of devastated fans sitting in their dimly lit suburban living rooms suddenly found themselves staring blankly at the newly purchased record sleeves resting in their trembling hands. The vibrant album artwork that proudly represented triumphant Southern rebellion just days ago instantly morphed into something profoundly sinister and utterly unrecognizable. Mourning teenagers and heartbroken factory workers experienced an intense, collective wave of paralyzing psychological dread. They simply could not bear looking at the glossy cardboard squares. The previously joyful visual representation of a victorious rock band, at the absolute peak of their creative power, now disturbingly resembled a horrific premonition printed in full color. Could a simple commercial photograph genuinely possess the dark supernatural ability to predict the brutal demise of the subjects it was immortalizing? As grieving journalists and obsessive music critics began meticulously analyzing every inch of the tragic artwork, a deeply unsettling pattern aggressively emerged from the printed shadows. You could physically place the polished promotional photograph side by side with the grim reality of the shattered aircraft fuselage. When you did, the terrifying visual parallels became entirely impossible to rationally ignore. The devastating realization slowly crept across the nation as people noticed exactly how the roaring artificial flames were positioned around the individual musicians. Those specific band members who were tragically killed or suffered the most catastrophic physical injuries in the brutal swamp crash were precisely the ones standing deepest inside the raging inferno. Meanwhile, the fortunate musicians who miraculously managed to survive the horrific aviation disaster with relatively minor injuries were noticeably positioned further away from the aggressive blazing fire. The carefully orchestrated artistic illusion of the blazing street survivors had magically manifested into a grim documentary of their own impending physical destruction. Now listen carefully, because the chilling visual symmetry between the Hollywood photoshoot and the grim Mississippi reality stretches far beyond a passing coincidence into something truly supernatural. If you look closely at the center of the cursed image, the charismatic lead singer stands defiantly with his eyes completely shut while a massive flame ominously licks his right shoulder. Right next to him, the newly recruited young guitarist is depicted with a horrifyingly bright halo of aggressive fire completely engulfing the entire upper half of his smiling face. Both of these incredibly talented young men were captured forever basking confidently inside the blazing golden heat of the artificial studio fire. Days later, they would violently lose their promising lives in the twisting metal wreckage. The visual contrast between their arrogant youthful confidence, captured on the glossy vinyl cover, and the sudden termination of their mortal lives created an incredibly suffocating atmosphere of despair. It was as if the ruthless universe had explicitly demanded a physical sacrifice, using the medium of rock photography to loudly announce its grim intentions. The innocent and pragmatic words shouted across that sweltering Universal Studios parking lot just weeks prior suddenly echoed backward through time like a devastatingly cruel supernatural curse. "You guys look like you are completely burning up in there," the enthusiastic photographer David had cheerfully yelled, while desperately trying to capture the ultimate visual expression of rebellious energy. That casual directorial command, originally intended to simply motivate the laughing musicians into giving a stronger physical pose, now resonated with the terrifying gravity of a dark Gothic prophecy. The pure excitement of creating a rebellious commercial image had accidentally captured the exact terrifying essence of their impending doom. It permanently froze the doomed men in a terrifying state of eternal combustion. Every single time a grieving fan pulled the vinyl record from its protective paper sleeve, they were essentially forcing themselves to witness the ghostly recreation of their beloved musical heroes violently perishing. This terrifying realization aggressively transformed the highly anticipated musical release from a celebratory anthem of working-class American resilience into an incredibly morbid artifact that people actively feared touching. The album cover was no longer just a standard piece of commercial marketing collateral. It had successfully mutated into a haunting physical manifestation of unavoidable tragedy resting quietly on countless suburban bedroom shelves. Grieving teenagers across the country reported feeling an intense, irrational urge to physically hide the cursed cardboard square, unable to withstand the mocking gaze of the doomed musicians burning alive. The heavy psychological weight of this unbelievable visual coincidence firmly anchored the legendary band into the darkest, most terrifying corners of modern American musical mythology forever. The roaring flames that were originally supposed to visually represent their unstoppable creative dominance had ironically become the exact blazing monument to their sudden, violent, and completely terrifying physical annihilation. In the immediate devastating aftermath of the Mississippi swamp crash, a profound wave of collective grief completely paralyzed the entire American rock and roll community. The executives sitting high up in the towering corporate offices of MCA Records were suddenly faced with an unimaginable and deeply morbid public relations nightmare. The vibrant, triumphant album artwork they had proudly shipped to thousands of record stores across the country just days prior was now practically screaming with a macabre irony. Staring at the cardboard sleeves lining bright retail shelves, the terrified label bosses realized the fiery image was absolutely no longer a celebration of untamed Southern rebellion. It had instantly transformed into a highly disturbing, painfully literal depiction of the exact tragedy that had just claimed the lives of their brightest stars. The cultural shock was absolutely visceral, leaving the devastated executives scrambling desperately in the dark for any immediate, respectful solution to mitigate the overwhelming national pain. An unprecedented corporate mandate was swiftly issued from the highest levels to urgently recall every single unsold copy of the album from store shelves nationwide. The panicked regional distributors worked feverishly through the cold autumn night to pull the controversial fiery sleeves away from the public eye before a media backlash could materialize. In a frantic attempt to erase the horrifying visual prophecy, MCA hastily replaced the blazing inferno with a somber, pitch-black background that felt entirely funereal and painfully bleak. The surviving band members were now pictured standing in an empty, echoing void that perfectly mirrored the sudden, devastating emptiness felt by millions of heartbroken fans. But what happened next will completely surprise anyone who thought the original artwork could simply be wiped cleanly from the historical cultural record. Did the corporate executives honestly believe they could erase this fiery tragedy by hiding it away behind a cheap curtain of manufactured black ink? The deeper truth was that their rapid intervention only served to dramatically amplify the chilling mystique surrounding that original, unedited piece of printed cardboard. By desperately trying to bury the flaming photograph, the record executives accidentally transformed the thousands of copies already sold into highly coveted, cursed holy relics. Out in the gritty industrial heart of Jacksonville, the heavy vinyl record sitting quietly on the passenger seat of Tommy's weathered Chevy truck completely shifted its fundamental meaning. It was absolutely no longer just a standard piece of commercial promotional artwork carefully designed to sell a collection of Southern rock anthems. The original pressing had permanently morphed into a chilling historical artifact, a frozen, haunting premonition captured perfectly in time, right before the southern sky violently fell. For working-class fans like Tommy, holding that original fiery cover felt exactly like holding a sacred, forbidden piece of history that the polished corporate world desperately wanted to destroy. It became a tangible physical connection to the fierce musicians who had voiced their everyday struggles, now forever immortalized in a haunting sea of prophetic fire. Those printed flames on that battered cardboard sleeve would forever burn brightly as a tragic, undeniable testament to a glorious era that ended in unimaginable sorrow. When the suffocating black smoke finally cleared over that desolate Mississippi swamp, the devastating reality of the horrific crash forever altered the unpredictable trajectory of American rock history. The fearless Southern band that had proudly carried the heavy, sweat-stained banner of the working class was suddenly frozen in time. Their incredibly meteoric rise was brutally cut short by an incomprehensible twist of cruel, unforgiving fate. Yet, the fiercely rebellious music they left behind absolutely refused to quietly die alongside them in those murky, unforgiving waters. Instead of permanently silencing their thunderous, ground-shaking anthems, the tragic accident somehow amplified their untamed voices. They loudly echoed with a haunting, ghostly permanence across the vast sun-baked expanses of the southern landscape. The very tragedy that violently shattered their physical existence ultimately cemented their absolute immortality within the sacred, untouchable halls of modern cultural mythology. Looking deeply at that infamous original cardboard sleeve today, the roaring flames that once completely horrified a grieving nation have slowly reclaimed their triumphant, defiant original intention. Those towering, magnificent pillars of bright artificial fire were never actually meant to represent literal, earthly destruction. They were simply meant to show the untamed and explosive energy of a brotherhood reaching the absolute zenith of their creative powers. Over the relentlessly passing decades, the undeniably eerie prophecy of the photograph has beautifully faded into a bittersweet testament to their relentless, blazing passion. The chaotic fire ultimately became a perfectly fitting visual metaphor for a massive musical legacy that continues to violently burn with an unquenchable brightness. They were simply young, ambitious men standing fearlessly inside a brightly simulated Hollywood inferno. They were completely unaware that their blazing artistry would effortlessly outlive their fragile mortal frames by countless unborn generations. Their raw, unapologetic sound continues to resonate deeply within the very soul of the American working class. It rolls powerfully out of massive steel factory floors and dusty pickup trucks just as it did on that fateful October evening. Every single time those explosive heavy guitar solos proudly tear through the crackling static of a local hometown radio station, the lost members are momentarily resurrected. They gave a powerfully enduring, defiant voice to the historically forgotten and voiceless. They expertly crafted timeless, gritty, blue-collar hymns that perfectly captured the honest sweat, the daily struggle, and the undeniable pride of the ordinary American citizen. The original vintage vinyl records that miraculously survived that frantic corporate recall remain treasured historical artifacts of a fiercely golden era. They proudly pass down the sacred, unyielding gospel of authentic Southern rock from one weathered generation to the exact next. It firmly remains a profoundly melancholy truth of the unforgiving universe that the brilliant artists who create our most indestructible cultural monuments are themselves constructed of fragile materials. They bravely pour their entire aching souls into fragile grooves of wax and spinning reels of fragile magnetic tape. They desperately fight against the relentless forward march of unstoppable time, only to be abruptly swept away by a single mechanical failure in the dark sky. The tragic, inescapable irony of the iconic Street Survivors album cover is that it accidentally captured the exact poignant moment these mortal men gracefully transitioned into ghosts. They proudly burned twice as bright as absolutely anyone else on the chaotic southern scene. They only left us behind with the beautifully haunting, smouldering ashes of what could have easily been a much longer, glorious reign. In the very bitter end, they truly were completely consumed by the raging flames. But it was the brilliant fire of their own indestructible legend. I would absolutely love to know, how do you personally feel when you look at that legendary original album cover today? Which of their timeless, rebellious rock anthems still speaks directly to your weary soul? Let me know your deepest, most honest thoughts down in the busy comment section below. Please take a brief moment to proudly share your own nostalgic memories of the enduring music that undeniably defined an entire American generation. If this somber, reflective journey through the shadowed corners of music history captured your restless imagination, make sure you are actively subscribed to the channel. Next time, we will be meticulously investigating the bizarre and completely unexplained disappearance of a massively important, completely irreplaceable master studio tape. It is a thrilling, deeply fascinating mystery that could have drastically changed the entire landscape of 1980s pop culture. Until then, please keep the volume turned up incredibly high, and thank you all so very much for faithfully watching Rock and Roll Mysteries.